in passing statutory changes.
I don't see that they always do so. Matter of fact, I look at Tabor, and I'll tell you that in the last 3 years, that legislature has run roughshod over Tabor, raising fees without voter approval, freezing the mill levy, putting forward the car registration tax. So yeah, I think there's all sorts of ways they don't respect the will of the voters. But I want to get into this issue. We're all agreed that we should have some sort of initiative process here, that we need something to rein in the legislature when they go too big. If they wanted to pass a law saying that you can stay in office forever, the people of Colorado said, no, we want term limits, and you might like term limits, you might not. They didn't pass it, we passed it. We passed it as a constitutional change, changing that owner's manual, if you will. Is that an appropriate use? Would you agree that something like term limits is a constitutional issue, not a statutory issue?
Personally, I do think term limits, even though I don't favor them, I do think that that's something that ought to be in the Constitution as opposed to state statute.
You know, I'll give you the example. I think it was Missouri that put in through the legislature passed a supermajority to raise taxes. All right, and that sounded good. You needed 60% of the legislators to say we need to raise taxes. They couldn't get their 60% 1 year, and so what did they do? With 51% of the legislature, they just repealed that statute. And that's why I think, and then they passed it with 51% of the legislature, not 60. So don't we need something? I mean, these are the type of things we all agree, I hope, are constitutional.
Yeah, I agree.
I think that makes sense, yeah.
Okay. Then where's the beef?
What do you mean?
What's the problem? The problem is that you think that too many people are using the Constitution to change what should be statutory laws. Is that basically the right way?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Let me bring it over here. There have been some stupid constitutional amendments. We have a ban on bear trapping in the state constitution. Oh, come on. I've got to agree with Alicia on this one. That should be a law. And if we find out that we've got bears everywhere because nobody can trap or hunt bears,
right,
you know, we shouldn't have to go to the voters to change that. That seems to be something that should belong to in the purview of the legislature. Should it not?
Probably. But I think the issue is that when the legislature has shown that it doesn't trust voters, the Constitution becomes the default place to make policy. So if we want to change that, and we think that it's a problem that too much is going into the Constitution, let's incentivize the statutory process by actually putting real protections in place, by making sure that if the voters do put something in the books, that they actually stay there and that the will's upheld. And once we've done that, if there's still a problem, then we can have a conversation about if the Constitution's too cluttered or if it's too easy. But right now, we're trying to just take away the right of the voters to amend the Constitution so that they won't put anything else in there. And really, why don't we just encourage the statutes?
Well, and I think that was the real beauty of Ref O, is that it did change the bar, so to speak, and made it easier for people to petition onto the ballot potential statutory changes, and made it harder, a little harder, to change the Constitution. Not impossible, but just a little more difficult.
Let me take issue with that.
All
Unless
right,
you have done a petition drive yourself, unless you have tried to amend the Constitution.
Oh, we leave that to you, John.
Yeah, we leave it to me. Trust me, this image that it's easy to get something on the ballot. Yeah, it's easy if you've got massive pockets in your Pat Stryker or Tim Gill or Jared Polis. Yeah, you can go ahead and buy your way on. But a lot of citizen activists, and maybe even Common Cause itself, you know, it is not an easy thing to do. Now let's Referendum O was something that was put on the ballot, what year? I'm trying to remember.
2008.
Yeah,
2008. And it was the legislature proposing it to make it more difficult to get constitutional changes, correct, but a little easier to get statutory changes.
Correct.
And again, this is something the legislature wants because they don't want us messing with what they're doing.
But it also had the prohibition. It told the legislature, if people do what you want them to do, in essence, make the statutory change, you can't touch it for 5 years, which I thought was pretty reasonable. You know, 5 years keeps the legislature away from that issue. You know, maybe they touch it after 5 years and that becomes a problem. Don't know, but I think that's a reasonable prohibition.
But if it's a statutory law, sometimes the legislature makes a law 1 year and then realizes the next year they went too far and it's a problem. Sure. I would take case in point the governor's tax on cars. I wouldn't be surprised, you know, the very next year if he tweaks it somehow. And that's why there is a difference between the statutory changes and constitutional changes. I get the feeling that a lot of people think that voters just can't handle this type of decision making, or we're just not smart enough.
Well, yes, and I mean, that is what the legislature has said in years past, that the voters have put bad stuff into the Constitution, did it unknowingly, and now we need to keep them from harming themselves anymore by taking that power away. And
Now, REFO failed.
yes.
Pretty substantially, if I remember. 52, 53?
52, something like that,
Okay,
yeah.
so it failed. But for those of us who get involved in these things, that is a real threat to our ability to get out there and affect changes. Why make it more difficult to pass a constitutional measure? I agree with you that there might be a reason to have statutory changes have a lower threshold, but the legislature can do that right now without any voter approval and just say if you need right now around 80,000 signatures to get on the ballot for a constitutional change, why don't we make it 60 or 40 for a statutory change? Why do we need to make it more difficult on one end?
Well, I think, and what I wrote in the Post earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, was that these have to be issues of great civic importance. And when they are, they will pass big. For instance, was the, and I'm going to have to look at my notes here, was the constitutional amendment that, let's see, 70% of Colorado voters approved Amendment 22, which required, I'm sure you love this one, background checks for gun purchases at gun shows in 2000. 70%, that easily clears the 60% hurdle. Another was the Amendment 41, the gift ban for politicians, which passed in 2006 with 63% of the vote. So it's not anywhere near impossible to get that kind of voter approval for issues that people consider to be very important. And I think those are the kinds of issues that we ought to look at for constitutional
Those are very
amendments.
emotional issues, depending upon what's going on. And after the Columbine tragedy, certainly something that looked like a gun show loophole got through. But when it comes to things such as campaign finance reform, term limits, taxpayer spending limits, are you saying that just because it's in the Constitution, we need to have a supermajority in order to change that, and why?
Well, because the Constitution ought not to be changed on a whim, I feel personally, or anything other than a pretty good, solid swell of public opinion.
But I don't see it changing that much. I mean, I look over the since we've had the petition process for 100 years, how often has the Constitution been changed?
You know, there have been several changes. I don't know the number, but just looking at the last 10 years, we saw 44 constitutional amendments that were proposed. Fewer than half were passed. The voters are a pretty good indicator. I mean, they have good judgment. If they like something, they approve it. If they don't, they reject it. And the idea that voters just willy-nilly put things in the Constitution isn't really backed up in truth. They reject quite a bit if they don't like it.
And so if we had this higher threshold, a lot of things such as term limits, taxpayer Bill of Rights, campaign finance laws, Amendment 23, which I absolutely despised, these things would not have gone through.
Well, campaign finance would have. I mean, there are 3 measures that have gotten into the Constitution with more than 60% in the last 10 years, and that's campaign finance, ethics, and the tobacco tax. But there's a handful of others that had majority support that wouldn't have, and if a majority of voters want something in the Constitution, it seems like they should be able to put it there.
How would you work this out? I mean, I've taken a look at the numbers, and it turns out that the legislature asks voters to change the Constitution twice as often as voters ask to change the Constitution.
And sometimes that's a cop-out, if you ask me. They don't want to decide on a particular issue, so they just say, "Oh, we'll kick it to voters." And I agree with you. I think they do it too often.
Well, wait a second. Why is it that the legislature can do it twice as often as we can do it? They can do it without any cost. We have to raise tons of money in order to hire circulators and gatherers. We have to go through all the lawsuits and the challenges from our opponents, guys like Mark Gruskin who make a living off of nagging people to death. They don't have to do that, but citizens who are also the legislature by the Constitution, we have to go through these hassles in order to ask people to change something.
Well, maybe this ought to be your next cause then, to take that power away from the legislature. I'm joking.
Hey, give it to me. I'd be happy with that.
I agree that they abuse that.